The position I take in this episode is one that tries to be most representative of the non-confessional, non-dogmatic field as I understand it. That is, the evidence-based studies that have revealed the social and historical forces of the ancient Levant that came to produce, ultimately, something like Judean monotheism in the context of the 6th century Babylonian exile, nearly solely represented by the prophet theologian responsible for the authorship of Isaiah chapters 40 through 55. A great deal of the rest of the text, most scholars and myself take it, are actually monotheistic-like pronouncements from those previous periods, like those in the Psalms, along with similar exclamations made by the Deuteronomist, are likely either examples of rhetorically exaggerated statements of monolatrous theology or exilic period interpolations of actual monotheism made by later redactors into the text. That is to say, the general attitude of non-dogmatic academic scholars is that monotheism of any form is a very, very, very late theological innovation, barely attested in the Hebrew Bible, if at all. And yet, Judean theology would certainly come to express a monotheism centered on Yahweh, and this episode explores the origin of that theological on-ramping and what, if any, primitive monotheism might be expressed in the Hebrew Bible. So, let's go make a lot of people twice as angry as it should probably make them think twice. At least twice. Now, while it might sound odd, the first thing worth pointing out is that the ancient Canaanites never really had a huge profusion of deities to begin with. Unlike other nearby regions, the Canaanite pantheon was always rather small. It basically consisted of one regal divine family, and a relatively small family at that. Thus, insofar as monotheism was going to be a historical whittling down of a pantheon until one god was left standing, so to speak, as opposed to some philosophical deduction of there being one and only one god, which does seem to have occurred, although much, much later, primarily in Greek speculation. That whittling down process was just numerically going to be objectively easier in Canaan rather than in Egypt or Mesopotamia. They're just less gods to get rid of. I mean, monotheism is the closest possible position to just atheism. You're just one god away. In effect, the Canaanite theological system consisted of a 4-tiered structure centered on a, again, relatively small divine family. At the top of that system was the fatherly god El and his consort, Athirat. The second tier were, unsurprisingly, his children, such as Baal and Anat. Below them is a much less attested group of deities, such as the craftsman deity god Kothar Vachasis, and finally at the bottom of the system were the various semi-divine servants and the warriors. In addition to these deities, there were primordial divine forces, such as sea and death, who would eventually be tamed by the warrior god Baal in the Baal cycle. Of course, other deities are also attested, such as some astral deities or the war plague deity Resheph, but in general, the 4-tiered pantheon seems to capture what the Ugaritic texts denote as the assembly or council of the gods in one complete but not totally coherent totality. What is interesting is what happens when Yahweh is introduced into that system. An archaic section at Deuteronomy 32:9 seems to be an early memory of a period when Yahweh was part of this divine ecology, but still regarded as a son of El, not the highest god, son of the god. In fact, the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scroll versions of this text probably preserve the more archaic polytheistic reading, with the Masoretic text undergoing a later kind of anti-polytheistic censorship, at least as argued by Manuel Tov. Who's to argue with Emmanuel Tov? Apparently at this primitive period, Yahweh was a second-tier deity with Elyon, the highest god, doling out his portion of the world for Yahweh to rule over. However, Yahweh's second-rate status was not to last. With his assimilation to El, something that the Israelites appear to have been universally pretty comfortable with, Yahweh would rise to the temp of the pantheon, but not without a fight. Mortal Kombat. for the gods. It's clear in the Israelite literature that Yahweh had to contend in popularity with Baal. They were just that similar. They're both warrior storm gods. And frankly, Baal was the incumbent regional deity, and the Elijah-Elisha cycles represent these theological contestations among Yahweh monolators and the cult of Baal. Further theological victory for Yahweh seems to have come with an interesting feature, or bug, depending on how you look at it. Recall that El had a wife, and thus a wife consort, Athirat. What appears to have happened is that Yahweh does eventually rise to the top of the pantheon, like Rocky style, at least for the Yahweh partisans, but there Yahweh is kind of immediately wed, in a sense, with a consort, the descendant of Athirat, Asherah. They're even linguistically connected. Yahweh got a wife, something attested in both archaeological inscriptions, but also in the Hebrew Bible, with Asherah devotion occurring in open-air elevated shrines, or bemot, but also within the Jerusalem temple in the form of a tree or a tree symbol representing her, much to the constant complaining of the prophet monolators of Yahweh. These mutations in the divine household would, however, continue. The concept of the divine council is definitely retained. The let us create in the first creation story. Psalm 82 likely has Yahweh standing among the various divine beings, condemning them to death for them being unjust. The framing sections of Job feature the Hasatan, the Satan as a kind of prosecuting attorney in the divine assembly, and Yahweh sends a spirit of deception to trick a bunch of prophets to get Achav or Ahab killed, which is one of my favorite, if not my favorite story in the Hebrew Bible, along with a retinue of messengers and warrior beings, the angels, and even the title Yahweh Tzavaot, the Lord of the Sabaoth. Just means Yahweh of the soldiers.